Coming in attractions, settings, and high correlation center interference is direct lines of modification how we see ourselves into calculate and modify, directing image visualization of your system through our astral selves. Our astral self is line screen adaptation cycles. It always comes in set correlation setting, first through attractions, and then your body comes in. But are you identifying what you're doing through the location setting? There is a line to communications that you follow, chain of command, in positions at all levels. Your convergence location setting, how you see yourself in your cognitive system location operation, your grounds levels, how to really understand how to use your space lines modulation through your mind system location of travel. This gets you a communication center where you have to really understand how to use your modification system all through your body, which is all communication lines of travel. That gets you in communications to your system. Now you understand more levels of you through operation. So everything I'm saying is something that you have access to, but this is times continuing. So everything you come across, anything through planet, anything through intelligence, anything information system, anything through symbolism, anything in settings, anything in travel, anything communication system, anything in calculation setting, it's all level of realism. In times continuance. We're just reaching those higher levels of frequencies, okay? Everything intelligence that's in your system has never left your system. You just brought it in through frequency and time consuming. Getting into that position locations gets you true understanding how to use it through operation, right? Especially you have to understand the integration system when you come to remote. There's a lot of calculation screen lines to the team lines into that sequence. Has to really understand how to use the connected system to their highways. Know exactly, am I off position? Am I off correlation setting? Do I understand construction zoning? Do I understand the highways? Do I understand the planets? Do I understand the off system? Do I understand the on switch? Do I understand the off switch? Do I understand my inhibitor point graphs? Do I understand my highway track lines? Do I understand my traffic, my inventory? Do I understand where I am in the mind? Do I know where I am in the mind, guys? You guys are all levels of frequencies that lives in times continuing, existing all at once. So you come into your mainframes in that position, its highways or its modems and all of the satellites, your body has to know where it is. The mind can't live without the body, and the body can't live without the mind of the body of the soul. It's a line of communication of attractions that you come into through times continuing into times continuance. We have to understand that in all levels of communications, how to use it at the vessels that we have to get in position lines of symbiotes. Core lines attract center interference and behavioral core centers lines of travel in communication system. All lines of high communication interference lines of travel. Getting direct lines of signals. You apply it to division locations. You go and contract locations to a planet that doesn't recognize you because you're not at that frequency. Let me say that again. A planet that does not recognize you because you are not at that frequency, but you brought it in through frequency at a certain time measure of times continuing. There's a reason why this is set up, but it's not a story. There's no beginning, there's no end. It's just times continuance of timeline. Now that timeline precedes the system locations through an allocated setting that puts a catapult in line communication setting to its continuance that allows you to see the energy in its frequency at a certain time measure of a map. Now you understand the identifications. Now you understand the operating system. Now you understand the soul modifications. Now you understand the soul direction. Now you understand the planet of its frequency because now you're ready in time continuance of times continuing. Okay? That's all this is. You're coming to higher lines of frequencies, especially with the team through capacity of the brain that puts position location, the percentage, and how you see yourself in space modulations and all levels of communication system that puts you in a track location into your binaries. You've got to get control with your emotional systems through integration and how you see things through remote. Because it starts to identify you in higher frequencies that you brought it in. You brought it in. Okay? Now, it's very confusing if you don't see the astros of self you coming first in that position that sets everything in set position of tone. It sets up the mapping sequence and the body follows. Whatever the mind does, the body follows in natural creations, right? So you go, we go. It doesn't just affect them, it affects everyone. Okay, and travel mechanisms and set positions. The sensitivity line screen adaptation to its alignment puts all communication center interference. Directing signal into modification. All right. Intelligence core line settings a code configuration system. Every time I pick up this pad, it's different levels of intelligence or codings. Now it could be the same coding, same intelligence. Different coding, same intelligence. different coding, different intelligence. It all depends on where you are in time's continuum. Flash line core centers of flash drive, core line centers of Saturn, and track lines communication system, and set position lines of calculation. Saturn, right? Saturn routes the routers, core lines of satellites, and two tracks lines of provision location of foundation grounds. Communicate ground core centers, communicates all communications ground center line, commits this location setting to its sun and moon at its track locations, right? So every planet has its own sun and moon. It has to. But every planet has its own sun and moon in track location and setting how it sees the sun and the moon through flux. Three lines of core centers, line condition of planetary service, line condition setting, Y tracks, core lines of symbolism, line core centers, and lines equal correlation setting and box location of center. Travel point lines of signals, Y line screen, triangulation lines of flux, core line centers of box frequency pattern. Direct lines of core centers, ground center line core is setting in position of process communication system all through travel calculations. Directing all laws of modification, right? All through Saturn. So planetary surface civilization system is truly understand how to use it through frequency ground lines, core centers and lines of communication setting. Now you guys have a test. You obviously know what it's about in the line communication. We continue on in forest lines of Q&A. But you have to start identifying location setting when you've got higher lines of communication at high frequencies. Now, nothing's in chronological order in your times, but everything is coming into time continuance of timeline. So I don't want you guys to get confused how you come into your provisions in cyclisms, core lines calculation near psychosis, and how you use it through modulation. Space correlation, all right? Space correlation is the core line that directs signals and modifications of time sequence that comes into time editing, time stamping, process communication lines of graphic, communications ground lines that puts all communication system how to use it in the brain frequency pattern and track location, all right? All right, directing lines, core centers, line direct signals into space modulation, triangulation lines of flux, calculate and modify into Y screen, travel lines of point lines of setting, process communication line, indicate position lines of process lines, and process data and position of three track location. All right, change core lines of direct signals into modification circulation and rotation surface into core lines of communications. Directing lines of location grids, platitude lines sequence, in screen adaptations of flux. Okay. Process communication ground centers, open signals, ground centers, line communication setting, and solar generation screen lines adaptation. Bring it in closer, lines of tractions. There it is in track location. Okay? So times continuum forces its communication lines of line signals. That's conceptual location setting when you come to calculate modify into catapult, catalyst, and screen line adaptations of elongateds. Elongating line screen adaptation opens all cycles, and line screen adaptation system all through track location system and travel. Okay, very powerful stuff. All right, directing line communication interference, platitude graph communication lines of ground centers, zero core centers of travel communication and metric meter location setting of Xylons. Now, a Xylon is a core line setting. It's a direct lines to a planet server locations at position locations, travel lines at foundation locations of Chiron and Chiron. Chiron is a line screen adaptation that puts lines of deciphering line core centers into cipher. Core lines of track line communication lines of mech location setting puts all lines of cybertronics, line connections to cybernetics, line core centers and cyberkinetics, in communications to cyber force. Directing in communication high center interference, line berserkate to Xylons, platitude core lines into fields of 6 lines of rotation surface, 3 core lines settings of travels, and point lines of communication. Process lines of indication ground centers, lines of triangulation. Scale core centers, line direct signals, and ground center locations of measure. Scale communication ground center locations setting all travels in position locations of home. Directing lines of 3 lines cycles, 3 track location lines of provision. Set core lines, calculation lines, XT1000 comes in, plasma line screen adaptation. Process calculation lines of 1 AKH, position lines of 1 pattern, 1 platform, 1 track line division location system, all through crop circles. Travel point lines of graph, in core centers, and a 45 split line communication anomaly. Track lines communication system, all through calculation setting. It disappeared. You saw it disappeared, right? It was there and now it's disappeared, right? So it's amazing how things disappear on its own through tractions, guys. It's amazing how you have to have a certain frequency in the confirmation cycle generation screen. Directing core centers, line communication system, and travel. So sending core centers lines of 1 planet, 2 lines of 4 over 6 over the lines of 12 into 24 lines of sequence. Directing all communication setting and travel point lines of graph, in communication setting and ground center lines of surface. Process communication high center interference, platitude lines of 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 system, 1 traction. Directing lines of ground line surface, line condition setting, lines of communication setting, cybertronics, lines direct signals. Now we come into the future of the presence. Directing lines, core centers, the clocking line communication center, and position location of cyborgs. Directing core centers, line communication of measure, scales communication lines of flux over core line setting, tubing line sequence lines of pattern. Directing line core centers puts all lines of tubing core center line communication lines, core lines of sonar, and line communication of measure that scales the communication system all through surface and track location. Channel point lines of graph, and set calculation setting, and flux over correlation. Okay, calculate and modify center core system, lines of travel, endpoint lines of high position locations, setting to measure. Scales communications high center of field locations into metronic locations, setting to travel. Directing imp modification system all through tubing, core line setting, and constellations and track locations. Right? Directing lines of 1 in position over 6, over lines of 2, over lines of 4, and position lines of 8. Travel point lines of graph, set position, sets calculations. Directing the core centers puts all communications ground centers. Symbolism lines of parallels in one track location, one provision, one cycle. One core centers, 1 second over perimeter. Set core lines of sonar, 3 lines of traction, 3 directions. Directing lines cross line signals in 6 lines of direction, set position location and setting. Process lines of 1 over cross line condition setting and energetic loan screen set position. Process calculation line ground centers, a center communication setting into X10001 cycle, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division. Now my equation. All right, so you guys are now in the future presence that correlates the system as xylons, core lines, high center interference, and calculation lines of decipher and cipher. Core lines of direct signals and modification screen lines, adaptation of surface. Travel point lines of graph at level line cycles, set lines of core centers, line position of 40 settings of travel, and direct signals into 26 volume, and set position lines of 5 of measure and track locations. 8 lines of charge, directing lines of 1 line position locations of side lines. Core lines of patterns, bringing everything communication lines of direct signals and calculations. Pi generation screens adaptation. Process lines of sonar line screen adaptation and processing. 4 over sequence lines of core centers into Xylon 1, Xylon 2, planet surface 1, planet 2 versus 3, inhibitors lines of screen, earth line rotation, and set calculation lines of earth line of position location of factor. Factor over screen, change core centers, direct signals to formula through quasar lines of screen line, adaptation lines of surface and track location and position of measure. Measure lines of scales, 45 split, lines of 4 lines split, lines communication settings, 6 over lines, 8 lines of 12, and 24 lines of 48. Direct lines of platform into position location of sonar tractions. Direct communication center interference into platitude ground center location setting to measure. Scales communication grounds, set position of sonar lines of 1 traction, 1 division, 1 locations into high core centers of xylons and line position location of sidebars and traction. Done by equation. All right, communication ground centers of flux in position location of 1/3 ground center, center interference. Travel point lines of graph and set core centers, directing in position locations all levels into cybertrons and direct signals into cyber force that communicates the setting as cyborgs and tractions. There's the cyborg. All right, set core centers into box frame, directing line symbolism location system, coming to red marks, directing line security lines of panels and direct signals, modification eye cycles, and set position and travel. There it is. Boom. Cyborg. Core centers, line direct signals, and core line center future adaptations. We go through the line communication setting of plasma walls. We direct lines of 1 indication setting to 3 lines of cycles, split lines of 3 lines of travel. Core lines highest interference of pi, generation screen, sonar lines of 1, 2, 6, 8, and 12 position lines of measure. Scales communication overline signals, process communication overline position location and setting. Communicate ground lines, shift lines of anomaly, and lines rotation surface and tractions. Direct lines core centers into space lines of black line screens, directing inline connection setting and processing communication lines of colossal. Core centers of set lines of core center interference, set thread signals into temperature readings and core lines of tractions, and set calculation lines in black holes and line sequence and line communication lines of travel and future of presence. Presence lines core centers line direct signals into communication setting. Process lines of A, process lines of B, process lines of C, process lines of E factor, core line settings of travel. Sets communication grounds line, high position location, computer operation notification system of travel. Point lines is high center interference, high position location system. Cross angles, time stamping, time editing, position of process communication. 1 signal modification, ground center line service, and track location system of travel. Done by equation. All right. So we take the 8 track and line communication with 1 line signal and 1 travel. Sets core line connection setting in position location to its satellite and track location. There's a satellite. Boom. Center core line direct signals off communication. Inline sync, directing lines of future adaptation of sideboards. Set communication ground centers. Allocate time frames. Directing modification of cross-line signals, highways of attractions, 3 lines of measure. Cross symbolism line, position locating 3 lines of 4, 4 lines of 6, and highways over track line direct signals into modified line screen adaptation of energetic dome screens, adaptation lines of surface. Over cross location lines and set position location settings. Towers of communication. Directing line core centers and sunlight routers sets communication colossal, line communication lines of measure that scales the communication setting, operate the system, all calculate and modify line direct signals into levels of track location. Setting communication high interference and tubing that puts us all calculate and modify. All right, look at that, it disappeared. I have to do it again and travel in rotation surface and track location. Okay, now, of course, setting lines of planet 1, planet 2, planet 3, and planet 6 in setting. Communicate ground centers of 3 lines of flux over track locations Xylon. Xylon is just a data platform. It's a processor communications that puts all communication to mechanism location of travel. How to use the platforms in communication setting into data sheets into lines of integration and set position. Core centers, directing lines of high center interference of computer framing, directing lines of barcodes, calculating, modify, and sequence lines of panels at position location to its blip, and travel lines of its pip, and align position and traction, all levels of direction signals into modification. Hooah! Core line centers, lines of calculus and setting, geograph maps, correlations and geotheorem, directing lines of symbolism over lines of cross location setting to 1 lines of measure. 6 core lines of high center interference in position of 5 lines of calculation, directing lines set high center interference in 1/6 position lines of panel into core lines of high center interference. You guys have to understand how to come in your times continuum. We can change anything through volume, anything through sequence, anything through panel, anything through clocking. Okay, that's the only way you can understand yourself through your own times continuum of force recognition, of pattern recognition, of face recognition. Okay. The heart line core line centers of 21 volume. That equal lines of core centers of Z line, core lines of construction zones. Directing lines of zoning commissions and direct signals to modifications. Traffic flow indicates lines, cross line signals, and line position location lines of equal line core center lines, position location and formation lines of high center interference. 5 ground centers of 5 line rotation surface, 5 behind and track locations, high center interference. 2 ones of tractions, 1 line division location, 2 line high center interference. Flux over 1, flux over 3 in position location, travel, and calculation. Directing signals, calculate and modify, line track calculus lines, presence lines, 1 signal modification, 1 ground centers, 1 position location of flywheel and track location. Process calculation of ground center lines of 1, process lines of 3, process lines of 6. Setting core lines of high setting cross line symbolism, line conditions crossing streams, directing line signal location setting and calculation. Communicate ground centers, line communications over the line signal location setting and travel. Okay, coming into line screen adaptation, sonar lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of measure and sketch position. Scales, directing lines of core lines, high center interference, and position location of graphs. Ground center lines of alpha, delta, and theta of communications of high center interference omega. Mega core line centers of grounds, set communication lines of xylons, sets core centers of travels, in graph communication center interference, in cerebral platforms, and track location setting of measure. Done by question. Structure lines, directing lines of symbolism, core line centers of primer circuits, lines of high center interference, 0 position location, travel through pi generation screens. Directing lines of flux, and 3 lines of calculations. 2 tractions, 1 directions, 1 cycle, 1 center. Apply 2 lines of 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 3 lines of communication, high direct signals, modification 1, in position of crossover 2, crosses lines of 3 track locations. Directing signals over cross location system and location setting to its ruler of metric meters. Core lines directing signal line core centers off communications on position location and travels in modification ground centers of surface and tractions. Direct calculus lines, energetic dome lines, rotation surface, and track locations. Okay. Flip line anomaly, travel line rotation surface and track location. Okay, change communications high direct signals, 1 center, 1 position over line signal in track locations. Platforms, core centers, line condition setting, position lines of 45 lines, core centers of 3 lines of laser, Skynet, SkyGrid line condition setting, in position location is cyberkinetics, and travel in point lines of communication. Direct lines, high center interference, bringing in signals and set position of 2 zeros in traction. 3 core centers, line direct signals, cross line communication system, over the track location of ground lines. Calculate and modify line communication setting, security lines measure, 1 position lines of 2 over 6 over 3 line setting, process communication direct signals and calculation high interference into transitions over modification ground centers and confirmation line connection to centers into wire of communication. Directing signals into calculated screen lines, adaptation of service at high levels of communication. That's a lot of traffic and flow. Calculate line screen adaptations. Bring in the blue lines, the core lines descended in plasma over cross location of screens, bringing in signals in position location to a system all through traction. Directing core line centers, light signals, lines of green, in position over green, and 3 lines of communications of go. Transition line screen, drain line centers, line communications all over the colossal, core lines of track and set position. Process lines of indication system brings box line centers of securing lines of measures in 3 calculation lines of screen adaptations of processing. Process lines of 1 in position lines of purple frame. Over cross locations underscore line screen adaptations of default. Cross line conditions set at overline position of purple in velvets and screen line adaptation of surface interactions. Calculate and modify line screen adaptations of traffic flow of indication system of space modulation. Space modulation ground centers opens all signals into securing lines of measures at overcross location of symbolism that process communication lines of high center interference of cells interactions. Direct communication high center interference puts all communication to green lines and communication high center created system and matrix lids and travel endpoint lines of communication. Directing communications over cross locations changes direct signals in cross communications high center interference, open all traffic in line position location in a setting that puts all communication measure and track location. All right. So it's basically understanding that everything has a traffic inventory, has a flow direction of timeline. It communicates as ground center interference, but it's very powerful through force vectors of time sequence. It's really interesting when you see it through energetic dome lines, core centers of travels, direct lines, modification centers, line communication ground high center interference of travel, endpoint lines, communication high position located data sheets, core centers of data files, and 3 track police lines of provision. Core lines set high center interference of box frames and direct signals into modification ground centers in open sequence in position to ear lines of transitions over calculation. Line signals bring it over across location setting into 5 lines of measure. Sets core lines of 2 lines of track location and 21 line traction. 1 line set it disappeared. Setting lines of 2 lines of 1 in position lines of 1 over frame, 0 lines of core centers, sun line, rotation surface, and track location measure that calculates the position location, allocate timeline frequency, and travel position and point lines of communication. Directing communication high centers, bring communication system all through the line calculation setting. Calculate and modify line communication setting to a clam. See the clam? Core centers line direct signals of sonar, reline communication setting to satellites that rotates the system of its routers that retracts its ground center line communication to sidelines, high position lines of its programs, copying lines, high center interference, copy and paste, directing lines enabled, line condition embedded in position of propagation system, protitude, line scoring lines adaptations into prodigies, and direct lines and modification center line position of system all through travel. Setting core lines at grounds, setting communicates high center interference, and position location point settings. Hooah. Center core lines setting directions. All right, take out travel lines. We're in 23 lines of cycles and 20 lines of measure. Scale communication line center interference. Take out position lines of portal, out through traction, alt divisions, back instructions. Measure back and signal into modification ground centers of surface. Hooah. Hope you had fun. Portal line defense line and screen line adaptation to a surface and track locations. Direct lines of modification ground center line can just open sequence line communication to its travel. Directing line communication setting over cross location system all through ground center locations to its open sequence. Setting direct signals and modification ground centers, line communication, cross line communication, high center interference, high direct signals into cross line symbols. Calculate and modify line track locational high centers that puts all communication system all through travel. Done by equation. All right. I know there's a lot going on that you're not understanding, but you understand the travel mechanism of force recognition timelines that comes in all communication setting all through travel. Okay? Because that's all it is. All you're doing, the brain itself, is just going through mechanism locations and ground lines that travels of wiring. It's rewiring, it's recording, it's lines of signals, it's high position it travels, it's getting direct lines of formula, it's understanding it's more lines of communications, high interference equations, it's getting direct line links in all core centers, how it comes in line position locations, how it measures its scales, and its travels, and its mechanisms, and its maps, and its sequence, and its panels, and its operation to assist locations and its center locations setting in position. Setting core line calculation setting to cyborgs and traction. Cyborgs. Okay? So, getting into the communications, understand the future, okay, of its present. So getting into that lines of anomaly is truly understand how position location to settings. Yes, Einstein interactions. It's already there in setting. So the mind conception is already there. So this is how it works in frame. I'll show you exactly, okay? This is your astral self, okay? This is your body, okay? So your astral self's up. The map and sequence lines of travel, endpoint lines of graph, 3-line rotation, surface track, and position of box frame, and position location, triangulation, and position of flux. Okay? That's the astral self that's done all this. Now you are here. That's you. That's the body, right? That's the body. That's the astral self doing all this. Okay? In time frame of time's continuing. Now, what you understand, all lines of mediation graphs. A mediation graph is a modulation screen that puts all communications, high center interference location setting, how you see vision or cortical locations at any travel. You're no longer seeing lines of projection of projecting lines of communication system. This is all levels you have times continuing existing all at once. Setting lines of communication, high center interference, astral self, then the body. So the body understands the travels in point lines of high center interference, visionary cortex, and track locations back in setting. That's how it's done. The window frames, the track locations of the eyes, and the windows of the soul. That's all it is in track locations. But it's amazing when you understand how to get into the formation grounds, in position location of travels, indirect signals, in modification direct, and inline core centered, interlinking, intercore line settings to travel in point line position to its location settings. Okay? So it's basically understanding how to use the mind conception of travel, right? It pixelates everything in travel. Right? Let's get in position of phrase recognition timelines. Process communication lines of vortex, elongated line communication, high interference, line position locations. So you're getting ready to energize. You go from here, there's your line signals. And then you're over here, putting yourself together, okay, through travel. Okay? So it's amazing how it comes into phase configuration system, all three cells, the regeneration line card settings, in position location truth line rotation service, in times continuum and times force, the position location of your system, all through track location setting to its operation surface contraction. From that to that, okay? And then you come into all lines of communications back into phase of recognition time sequence and travel. From that to that to that, okay? So that's what your cells do. All through modification lines of visionary cortex line calculation setting. Through the sequence, line direct signals modifications. Time allowance puts lines into all lines of modification on cloud lines, indirect signals and calculation screen lines adaptation of surface. Process lines of data, process lines of informations, process lines of ground set calculation. All right? Ground set lines of 1, prodigy, communication lines of surface, and track lines of 3. Data information lines outbox, outline, outsignal, into modification mainframe, and track location of central frame that changes the communication lines of travel. Direct calculation lines into 3 symbolism lines of dots, lines of high interference, radio signals, ground lines of high interference, 3 lines of wires and communication setting, snowy graph interference, changing lines of pixelation graphs, course centered into the opposite directions, into box frames and travel. Calculated line screen adaptations in the opposite signal location lines of high center interference location and travel. Points lines of setting, center operation set correlate setting, into platforms of grounds, into platforms of atmospheres, in position of magnetic highways and correlation system, into its clouds in track location. So it's a lot of fun when you really get in that position, location, energy, line core set as a center. Operation of U of travel. Okay? So center position lines of U expands all lines of communication, starting with that track locations. That's all it is. You're expanding, and you're expanding, and you're expanding. Okay? You're expanding, you're expanding, you're expanding. Okay? You're platforming, you're traveling. This is what your avatar does first in oversoul. And set position. It sets up the parameters, securities, and the highways, guys. And that position here, this is your body. Looking what's going on. That's your body. That's your avatar in sequence in times continuum. Platforms, communication, high center interference, the ground lines of 1, 2, and 3 platforms with set position location, high center interference location setting. Seconds over minutes, minutes over pi, hours over seconds. Indirect signals modification. Ground center lines of 1, ground center lines of 2, 0 calculation lines of 0, position location, platform, communication, high position location, and travel. That my equation, right? Center core system and a forward line split, lines of anomaly in track locations. Travel represents time sequence of center operation. 3 core centers of flux. Anomaly switching, core centers of platforms in communication, high center interference of travels in point lines of communication. Center core line centers indirect signals of box frames in set position to its calculations. Setting a box frame communicates lines of times continuing and track location of a system all through measure. Okay? Put it this way in line position location settings. Up-down sequencing lines of travel. Okay? Platforms and communication lines of grounds. So hopefully everybody understands what's really going on in that position location of a system when you calculate and modify all lines of correlation setting to sign lines or anything location of its intelligence, information locations, and all settings. But at least you got an introductions through all communication system of future adaptation of its presence, of its locations, of times continuing. Okay? Oh, yes, you're welcome in line communications there, Vega. So all you're doing, guys, is you're just expanding. That's all you're doing. Your center communications this way, your center communications this way, and this way. So you have 3 platforms in set position, right? This is the body, okay? This is your avatar, right? So your avatar is here, here, and here in set position locations and setting. 6 lines of hours, 12 lines of hours, 24 lines of hours and track locations. It's all set up, right? 3 different line core centers of box frame position locations. Not through lines of projection, all through time lines of continuance. 3 lines of box frames, right? Set position of 1 in position of 2 for the body to understand. And once the body understands, let's change it up and track location lines, highest interference, ruler, measure, and scale, and track location. Box frame lines of 1, box frame lines of 2, 3, and 4 lines of measure. Sets communication ground, highest interference of box frame, in position triangulation ring, high frame, mid location, setting of travel. Sets communication lines of platforms of 1, in position lines of 2, in position lines of 3, in position lines of 4, and center core system of portal and track location. Disappeared by itself. There it is. Now the central system comes in high setting, bring it in correlation setting and travel, right? Modifications of lines of 1 into 2 into 3 into 4 of sonar and traction. Hooah! Up signals line screen adaptation to flux over screen lines adaptations and a 45 split lines of anomaly. Okay, change lines core centers of your pi, generation screen lines adaptation system, right? Change core lines settings into 4 line split lines communication. Sonar division location of sign lines, highest interference into cipher, line communication, highest interference, central systems, mainframes, core lines, track interference, line direct signals, modification lines of 0s and 1s. Setting communication ground lines of 1, 2, 6, 8, 12, 14, and 20 set position. Setting core lines, sending high interference lines of tunnel and defense lines communication. Setting core line centers of tunnels, indirect signals into 1 center, 1 surface, and 1 track locations. Override the system lines, the space lines, the correlation lines, attractions, indirect signals, and calculation. Setting communication ground centers, line communication split lines, and communication interference lines of travel. Core lines at high set identification of the system, all through traction. So it's constantly in position lines of 4 lines at different angles and travel. Okay. Sets communication grounds, set core centers, and symbolism in line screen adaptations of flux, and screen lines adaptation lines of surface. Process communication high set interference of flux and communication setting. Sets communication high set interference in 1 router, 1 position, 1 program. Process communication high set interference 1, 2, 3 lines of 6 lines of minute set calculations. Sets communication high set interference, lines of track location, lines of high position location to a system, all through satellites and traction. Comes into the cone line and screen lines adaptation setting through satellite and track location of sonar. See the satellite, see the sonar? Remember, it's times continuing. So changing boxes, triangulation, or anything through flux, or anything configuration lines of body frame, or anything through track frame is constantly in continuance. You've got to get out of continuing. Forcing communication lines out of phase, out of position, out of traction, out of division, out of locations. The more you come into the lines of time allowance, that gets you into more modification, screen lines, adaptation of the flux, to understand how to use it in all communication setting to its manifestation location to its system, all through attractions and directions. Okay? There we go. All right, that's it. See you in 5.